Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, November 21st, 2017. Yeah, it is still 17, isn't it? I'm still waiting for this to end, but it appears to be dragging things out. Yes, today is Tuesday, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. We'll be back with a show tomorrow. Just leave. Goodbye. We're going to be back with a show tomorrow. Everything seems to be working. That's the good news. And nobody has to tell me what they're thankful for just to listen to the show. Justice reminds me, as he signals me that everything is going A-OK and all the music is going out correctly. He says the interlude, the little musical interlude we played before beginning of the show, says it's thankful for interluding Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Did you get a wind? Get a look at that? Did you get wind of it? Did you get a wind? Does anybody have any wind? I guess I should check before we go on the air. Of yesterday's game. I don't know what to make of that. Everyone was very upset with the White House press corps, I guess, for playing along. Although, I don't know. It was relatively harmless, although, I don't know. I guess you could read a sinister motive into it of controlling the press and infantilizing them, but I don't know. Whatever. It didn't seem to have made any difference. It certainly didn't make any difference in the quality of the press conference. So, whatever. We'll skip over that other than just noting for the record that it was weird and awkward, as most things in the Trump administration, such as it is, usually are. Today is Tuesday. Today's the day we've set aside for our 10 o'clock hour for the, I don't know, should we call it an epic debate? Will it be a reasonable, rational discussion? Will it be an epic debate? Will it make for great radio? Will it, I don't know. Yes, it will. Let's just say it will. When Armando, our own Armando Llorens, and Ben Spielberg, do I add a little SH sound to that just to emphasize everything? Ben Spielberg will be joining Armando. And you know what? This is a good question I'll have to pose to Armando. I'm not 100% certain whether, am I supposed to moderate this thing, or am I a participant, or both, or does it matter? Is it okay if I wing it? Ben Shapiro will be, no, not Ben Shapiro. Ben Spielberg will be on with Armando to discuss the DNC's proposed reforms, I guess prior to when we actually formally see them at the last meeting of the DNC Unity Committee. And we'll be talking about superdelegates will be on the table, caucuses versus primaries. We'll try and figure out from Ben where the Bernie Sanders wing is. And even people will even then object, I think, to calling Bernie Sanders' wing a wing of the Democratic Party, because I guess it's questionable, right? Anyway, we'll try and set some of the petty stuff aside and get down to the substance and see if there is some area of agreement. And I do think we can hammer something out on. I think we're actually ending up on the same page on caucuses, even though the Sanders folks were enamored of the results of the caucuses. I don't know that they're standing by their inclusiveness as they are currently formulated. So we'll see, and we'll experiment with this and think about what we can do with it in the future, and see about whether there are other people who might want to participate in such a forum. Let's see what's happening out there in the wider world today. Daily Coast Radio is live now. We are reminded by Bill in Portland, Maine, joining Kagro X for an epic cage match today. Yes, you'll find in Bill's tweet, which I will retweet for all of you who are following along, links to both Armando's Twitter address, in case you didn't know it, and Ben Spielberg's. And so you can follow along, both in anticipation of it on Twitter and live here on the air, and of course later in podcast. Teeth meet floor. That's a good line there, Bill. And, well, we'll try not to disappoint. Also, as a special favor to all of us, I think, really, I've talked with Justice. We are going to eliminate, because we are no longer broadcasting on terrestrial radio anywhere at the moment. There's no real need for these breaks. I know a lot of us would like to get rid of all the breaks entirely. I'm going to just eliminate the 10 o'clock hour break. We'll do the one at the top of the hour, start our discussion with Ben and Armando, and then not bother with that 10:30 break. We'll just we would get in the way of the conversation and engineering it and having everybody just pause for 2 minutes just seems like too much to try to explain this early in the morning. So huge, I don't know what, huge development in the way we'll be producing the show. Let's see. Things that came to my attention this morning that require immediate attention, as well as things I've been storing away for you and things that have been suggested to me by Greg Dworkin, who is not here with us this morning, but nonetheless had some suggestions for where we might go in the morning. This first one, though, where is this? Where did I not put this one away? I thought I did. Well, we'll bring it up via phone, I guess, because my brother Mark sent me this one in a text this morning, and I thought, gee, that's odd. Let's take note of that, shall we? CBS News reporting for us that the U.S., that's the United States, that's us, actually. It actually spells us, but you know that, voted against an anti-Nazi resolution at the UN, which struck me as odd. I don't know whether this is something that comes up a lot. I don't know whether this was something we've voted against in the past. Like, why would we do such a thing? There's an explanation. I'll give you the AP's story here. It's brought to me anyway via CBS News, but it's an AP story. The United States says it was one of 3 countries to vote against a UN resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism over freedom of speech issues and concerns that Russia was using it to carry out political attacks against its neighbors. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how to untangle that one, except I guess what they're saying is we thought, oh, well, you ought to be able to have the freedom of speech to say you are a Nazi or glorify Nazis. I'm not certain what the other part is here. We voted against it over freedom of speech issues and concerns that Russia was using it to carry out political attacks against its neighbors. Like, we thought the resolution was a Russian political attack. Is that what, I mean, I guess it's possible in a convoluted way. I'd love to have somebody try to explain that one to me. Now, normally, I don't know, maybe it's not the case. Maybe this has come up before and the United States traditionally votes against. This feels like the sort of story that we will find out later from some old UN hand that, this comes up every couple of years and we vote against it because freedom of speech and we've done it under all presidents. I don't know whether that's the case. I don't really recall having to condemn Nazism all that frequently recently in the UN. And, the UN, the history being what it is, I thought they might have some special interest in condemning violent ultranationalism. But because that's just what the UN, likes to concentrate on. We're not really ultranationalists here. We try not to do that. We try to shy away from violent eliminationist rhetoric, but apparently not this time. Anyway, the resolution entitled Combating Glorification of Nazism, Neo-Nazism, and Other Practices that Contribute to Fueling Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance was nonetheless approved by the UN's Human Rights Committee on Friday with 131 votes in favor, 3 against, and 48 abstentions. We're ignoring the abstentions here. Were they just absent? I don't know. Well, anyway, the other 2 no votes were Ukraine, which makes me think, is it possible? Is that what they were talking about? Like, the Russians are backing this resolution and they are trying to distance themselves from the Nazis that they back here in the United States or something like that. I don't really know. Palau was the other no vote because Palau loves Nazis. I don't really know what their reasoning was. But anyway, we condemn without reservation all forms of religious and ethnic intolerance or hatred at home and around the world, said Deputy U.S. Representative to the Economic and Social Council Stephanie Amadeo Amadeo, yes, right, explaining the U.S. vote. However, due to this resolution's overly narrow scope and politicized nature, and because it calls for unacceptable limits on the fundamental freedom of expression, the United States cannot support it, Amadeo said. We only read the title, after all. She said the U.S. also disagrees with the resolution's willingness to curb freedom of expression, even while sharing its concerns about the rise of hate speech around the world. This resolution's recommendations to limit freedom of expression, freedom of association, and the right to peaceful assembly, well, that's the problem. Anyway, contravene the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and must be opposed, Amadeo said. But 131 other countries were completely wrong on this. Unlike resolutions in the Security Council, resolutions in General Assembly committees are not considered legally binding, and so nothing will change, I guess, and we can all relax about the question of whether we'll all be forced to hug Nazis anytime soon. I guess that's not happening, but just thought I'd throw that little item out there, and then I'd wonder, how come that never made it into Pocket? I'm pretty sure I saved it. Well, we'll try and make sure that it gets into our roundup of the day. Speaking of our roundup, let's see, other items shared by Greg Dworkin, his ideas for inclusion in the show. Some of them are actually quite long reads, as it turns out, but others of them are not. One of them actually represents a big piece of news of the day. Let's open that one up. He has sent me the Bloomberg report, GOP surrenders cherished IRS scandal at last. The fiction served the GOP for years, yet died quietly this month, forsaken and alone. Yes, interesting. Pardon me there, short break, unscheduled. Francis Wilkinson is behind this latest entry from Bloomberg. You'll recall, I think you all remember what we're talking about, the Tea Party folks for years insisting that they were being persecuted unfairly and singled out for persecution, as a matter of fact, by the IRS. Turned out not to be true, and that the IRS was monitoring political activity by nonprofits or claimed nonprofits on all sides, both sides, as it were, of the spectrum. The IRS scandal came to a pathetic, whimpering conclusion earlier this month. I like the way this is put. For half a decade, the scandal had kept delinquent members of Congress occupied and served up reliable programming to Fox News and other conservative media. But when Internal Revenue Service Commissioner John Koskinen walked out of his office on November 9th, of his own volition, by the way, on schedule, his fine reputation intact, the whole greasy production quietly expired. Wow, tell us what you think here. Anyway, when President Barack Obama appointed Koskinen, I'm again always guessing at his pronunciation. I never see it pronounced on television. I don't know why that is. I don't watch. Anyway, when he was appointed in 2013, the Republicans had been swinging at the IRS for some time, and they continued to do so anyway. A band of House Republicans later attempted to impeach him, claiming various misdeeds, but it was a late-inning stunt, a too obvious effort to extend a scandal that had served so many so well for so long. Shortly before Koskinen left office, the Treasury Department Inspector General for Tax Administration released the presumably final report on the scandal. Like a previous Inspector General report, it tried to soothe Republican feelings. The IRS really should have handled things differently, while utterly refuting Republican charges about what had transpired. The story told by Republicans is so well known that it substitutes for fact, a key observation. In the first years of the Obama administration, Tea Party groups and other conservative organizations rose up to defy the government. When the groups sought IRS approval for their designations as social welfare organizations under the tax code, the IRS targeted them with burdensome queries, harassing the groups while slow-walking reviews of their applications. In this telling, it was a political vendetta carried out against conservatives by a government agency that many anti-government, anti-tax conservatives especially despised. Republicans claimed the IRS served as an attack dog for the Obama White House. but inquiries by the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the Senate Finance Committee, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and the Justice Department all failed to produce evidence of political interference. Perhaps it was because the premise of the scandal, that Obama's political team would want to destroy local Tea Party groups, was absurd. For Democrats, local Tea Party groups were a political giving tree. Really? You think so? Bearing glorious loopy fruit, such as Christine O'Donnell and Todd Akin, Tea Party candidates who managed to lose crucial Senate campaigns that a competent Republican, perhaps any competent Republican, would have won. I guess they although they served a purpose, they made us overconfident in the eventual defeat of Donald Trump, I would say. Anyway, by the way, Christine O'Donnell never rose to prominence in any way, shape, or form. Todd Akin was a sitting House member. I think we ought to throw that out there. What's more, none of the groups actually needed IRS approval to operate. These organizations didn't have to wait for the IRS to tell them anything to go into business, Koskinen said in an interview last week. Yet the IRS clearly applied extra scrutiny to groups that it thought might be engaged in too much politics to warrant the preferential tax designation. Okay. And I think properly so. One way IRS personnel did that was to look for keywords such as Tea Party. Like, hello, this is what we are. Other words that triggered IRS scrutiny included Occupy, green energy, medical marijuana, and progressive. Contrary to the Republican story, the IRS never targeted conservatives. The IRS targeted politics, which was pretty much what it was supposed to do. In September, the Trump Justice Department reaffirmed the decision of the Obama Justice Department not to prosecute Lois Lerner, the IRS bureaucrat whom Republicans settled on as a criminal mastermind after they had failed to find an exploitable connection to Obama. The great thing about it for the Freedom Caucus and Capitol Hill, Koskinen said of the GOP's investigative shtick, was that it could keep going. You start with the substance of the issue, and when that runs out, you go to the process. And when that runs out, you go after the messenger. The failure to punish someone upset Republican Representative Kevin Brady. Lost all his hair. He was so upset. Today's decision does not mean Lois Lerner is innocent, Brady stated. It means the justice system, yeah, he's that upset, in Washington is deeply flawed. Brady is not a reckless Freedom Caucus radical. No, not at all. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, he is. And he is considered one of the more knowledgeable, capable, and responsible members of the House Republican Conference. And there's the rub. The scandal wasn't just a production to keep fringe Republicans busy and far removed from serious business. It was part of a propaganda campaign with institutional GOP support all the way up to the Speaker of the House. Hey, this is pretty good. An October story in Politico quoted retired House Speaker John Boehner in a fit of candor. Freed from his party obligations, Boehner was unsparing in his denunciations of two of the IRS scandal's biggest promoters, House Freedom Caucus leader Jim Jordan of Ohio and former Representative Jason Chaffetz of Utah. As head of the House Oversight Committee, Chaffetz had tirelessly flogged the IRS scandal. Boehner called him a total phony. That's a quote. Boehner described Jordan in more incendiary terms, calling champion of government shutdowns, budget showboating, and governing chaos a, quote, legislative terrorist. Both men earned their labels, yet the gutter tactics that brought each to prominence were championed by Boehner himself. He invested Chaffetz and California Representative Darrell Issa with vast investigative powers and then indulged the falsehoods and character assassination in which they trafficked. He mounted a Benghazi extravaganza that had more theatrical lives than cats. In a 2013 press conference, Boehner expressed fury over the scandal at the IRS, not because it was a partisan charade costing taxpayers tens of millions of dollars and countless hours of government employee make work. Boehner, like Brady, was enraged that no scapegoat was taking the rap. Now, my question isn't about who's going to resign, said the then highest-ranking Republican in Washington. My question is who's going to jail over this scandal? So yes, it was heartening to hear Boehner confirm the truth about his former colleagues, but the next time the former speaker organizes a charity golf outing, perhaps he can apply the proceeds to Lois Lerner's legal bills. Wow. I guess they felt it necessary to remind us at the end here that column does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the editorial board or Bloomberg LP and its owners. I guess it's solely the responsibility of Francis Wilkinson. And you can, I guess, send him a bunch of money if you want to. You can contact him in the email address here enlisted and tell him that was a great article. Thanks for writing it, even if everyone was disclaiming your views on it. Okay. Let's see. What else? Boy, everybody's trying to distract me with stories today. Thank you, Athena, for your link to the story about police who had to cut their interrogation short after a suspect refused to stop farting. That sounds pretty important. And it's in Time magazine, the failing Time magazine, which I guess may find its way back with this sort of whoopee cushion humor. It happened in Kansas City, Missouri, home of the unstoppable flatulence, I guess. I don't know. Is that like the world capital of it? It is now. Does everybody need to know about this? A police interrogation of a Kansas City man charged with drug and gun offenses, of course, ended prematurely when an investigator was driven from the room by the suspect's excessive flatulence. Don't they have gas masks? I mean, you can't get rid of these guys throwing tear gas canisters back at them at a protest, but this guy couldn't stand somebody farting. All right. A detective reported that when asked for his address, 24-year-old Sean Sykes Jr. Sean, you did it. I'm the first one who knew it this morning, but I think you actually blew it. Sean leaned to the one side in his chair. That's nice of him, and released a loud fart before answering. I don't think that's illegal. Although I don't, show me in the Constitution where it says you can do that, I guess. The Kansas City Star reports that Sykes continued to be flatulent. That happens. And that the detective was forced to quickly end the interview. I don't really think that should have ended the interview, though it should end the story. Sykes appeared in court on Monday, charged with being a felon in possession of 3 firearms, none of which were his ass, by the way, and possession with intent to sell cocaine. And by the way, if he's one of those guys that hides the cocaine there, don't buy from, well, now you can't. He's in jail. The charges stem from police traffic stops this month and in September in Kansas City, Missouri. The Federal Public Defender's Office hasn't responded to an Associated Press email seeking comment on Friday. They're all dead. So that's sad. Anyway, we mourn their passing. Hi-yo. All right. There's a lot of passing we mourn in this. Thank you, Athena, for lightening the mood today. Okay. Well, I know there's like more important stuff out there, and we should probably be paying attention to some of those things. And, well, gosh, let's take a look at a few things we might choose to include before the first break, which we are going to take. There are a couple other suggestions for long reads from Greg, and we're not going to be able to fit those in before the break, but let's see. Well, there's an awful lot of interesting things. I would say one of the other shorter items of interest this morning, the report from, well, that I read in BuzzFeed yesterday. I don't know whether they were the original reporters of the story, but sources, somebody's sources anyway, say that Trump is a moron again. This is National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. The headline says, McMaster mocked Trump's intelligence at a private dinner, which is a great place to mock his intelligence. I would do it at any meal, to be honest. And it wouldn't even require giving me something to eat. I would do that, for dimes on the street corner or for free. I'd, in fact, pay for the opportunity to do it, which is, generally speaking, what we're doing here. Let's take a look at this. Joseph Bernstein reporting this story. And is it an original for them? I think so. I don't see any links to outside sources. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster mocked President Trump's intelligence at a private dinner with a powerful tech CEO, according to 5 sources with knowledge of the conversation. That's pretty interesting. And he's not mocking his intelligence sources like the CIA. He means, of course, his own really great brain. Over a July dinner with Oracle CEO Safra Catz. who has been mentioned as a candidate for several potential administration jobs, by the way. It's interesting. McMaster bluntly trashed his boss, said the sources, 4 of whom told BuzzFeed News they heard about the exchange directly from Katz. The top national security official dismissed the president variously as an idiot and a dope with the intelligence of a kindergartner, the sources said. A 6th source, who was not familiar with the details of the dinner, that would be me, told BuzzFeed News that McMaster had made similarly derogatory comments about Trump's intelligence to him in private, including that the president lacked the necessary brain power to understand the matters before the National Security Council. I agree. That was not actually me, the 6th source, but I also have no knowledge of the dinner and think that the president lacks the necessary brain power to understand matters before anything. Honestly, I don't think he has the brain power not to step on a banana peel. Both Oracle and the Trump administration heatedly denied the comments that Katz later recounted. Actual participants in the dinner deny that General McMaster made any of the comments attributed to him by anonymous sources. Those false comments represent a diametric opposite of General McMaster's actual views, said Michael Anton, spokesman for the National Security Council. Oracle's top D.C. executive, who attended the dinner with Katz, also denied that McMaster made the comments his boss later recounted to others. The meeting, Oracle Senior VP for Government Affairs Ken Glueck said, was about China, and none of the statements attributed to General McMaster were said. Glueck added that Katz concurs entirely with his account of the dinner. So, I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of it or whether I care. I just believe it. Glueck responded to repeated inquiries only after BuzzFeed News contacted the NSC. And according to 2 sources with knowledge of the situation, administration officials threatened to retaliate against several figures with knowledge of the July dinner if they spoke to BuzzFeed News. Really? Just specifically BuzzFeed? Asked whether he had made his statement under pressure from the administration, Glueck responded, ridiculous. And, gosh, I'm sure it is. We'll be back with more idiocy after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. And there's more to this. There's like deeply sourced background reporting and everything. This carries on. It's not just a story about calling the president an idiot, though that's pretty good news all by itself. Let's see. McMaster's allegedly dismissive comments are the latest suggestion that at least some of Trump's senior-most aides see their jobs as containing a president who isn't up to the task. I did skip over a little paragraph here that reminds everybody that supposedly McMaster, along with, it was once believed, White House Chief of Staff John McKelly, regular Kelly, that the two of them, former generals, often seen as moderating influences on the president and steadying hands in an administration staffed with political newcomers and anti-establishment bomb throwers, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think very many of us believe that about John Kelly anymore. And we just haven't heard enough coming from McMaster lately, other than this, which gives us any reason to believe that it's true, but I'll take it. Anyway, in October, NBC News and other outlets reported that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, you'll recall, called the president a moron in a July meeting at the Pentagon. All this stuff is going on in July. Also in October, Republican Senator Bob Corker told the New York Times that a group of senior administration officials have banded together to try to keep Trump under control. News of the July dinner first surfaced in August. I don't know why exactly we're hearing about it now, but it happened in August, or it surfaced in August, when Axios reported that Republican mega donor Sheldon Adelson decided to support a campaign alleging that McMaster was anti-Israel after speaking with Katz about her meeting with the National Security Advisor. That decision stemmed, multiple sources tell BuzzFeed News, from comments McMaster made to Katz praising President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran and describing Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory as a major problem. But these new details reveal that the subject matter of McMaster's dinner with Katz, which sources tell BuzzFeed News took place on July 18th at the Washington, D.C. restaurant Tosca, ranged far from geopolitics. Indeed, 3 of the sources said that McMaster disparaged multiple members of the administration to Katz, including Tillerson, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, oh boy, and former White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, that's easy to believe, and President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner, that's easy to believe too. Of Kushner, one source told BuzzFeed News McMaster said he had no business being in the White House and should not be involved in national security issues. That's just true. Katz said the conversation was so inappropriate that it was jaw-dropping, another source told BuzzFeed News. I guess it would be. I mean, it would be funny, and I'd enjoy it, but it is inappropriate for the National Security Advisor to say such things. But then again, it's inappropriate for Donald Trump to be president. The Israel-born Katz, which, by the way, is spelled with a C and a Z, in case you were wondering. And now I throw the whole spelling thing into disarray. Everyone probably assumed K-A-T-Z, but it's C. And once I say it's a C, they wondered, is it an S at the end? It isn't. The Israel-born Katz served on the executive committee of then-President-elect Trump's transition team and has been floated for numerous posts in the Trump administration, including U.S. Trade Representative, Director of National Intelligence, why, I don't know, and co-chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. While Katz hasn't wound up in any of these jobs, Oracle has stayed closer to the Trump administration than many of the other high-profile tech giants. The company has a major presence in the nation's capital, disclosing nearly $10 million in lobbying expenditures so far in 2017, more than Facebook. Katz attended the July dinner at the F Street lobbyist hotspot with Glueck, who Recode described as one of the most powerful political operatives in Silicon Valley. Katz, who has donated widely, and probably wildly, to both Republicans and Democrats, and McMaster, who has long been a target for the pro-Trump media and the nationalist wing of the administration for his mainstream positions on foreign policy and his purge of staffers hired by his predecessor, the notorious spy Michael Flynn, are both establishment figures. And yet, according to sources, Katz was so alarmed by the tenor of McMaster's comments about President Trump and Israel that she confided her concerns to several administration officials as well as Adelson, and now, of course, denies the whole thing. That's real interesting. By the way, another interesting observation made just a few minutes after I saw that item. Where was this? Somebody was noting on Twitter, and it was a lot easier to find 2 minutes ago. Oh, here we are. Let's see if I can bring this tweet up. Kate Brannon, B-R-A-N-N-E-N, who is, of course, everything. Look, all I want to know is who she is, but it won't just tell me. I have to go scrolling all over the place. All right, let's take a look again at her profile page. Deputy Managing Editor at Just Security, _security is their Twitter handle. Anyway, formerly at Foreign Policy, Politico, and Defense News, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, in case you were wondering about that too. Kate Brannon had this to say: interesting wrinkle to the story, Ezra Cohen Watnick. Do you remember the name? I'm sure we mentioned it at least once or twice on the show. I don't think we read some of the longer profiles of this guy who had sort of embedded himself at the National Security Council for a while and was a serious problem, and McMaster couldn't stand him, and it took him a while to purge him. He eventually did purge him from the ranks. He had been planted there with the support and had been saved a couple of times by Jared Kushner in all this. Ezra Cohen Watnick, removed from his National Security Council post by McMaster, now works where? Anyone want to guess? Because, I don't know why you would guess anything other, given that we just read this article, other than Oracle. You would be right. He works at Oracle now, and in what capacity, I don't know, but interesting. It does throw a certain different light on Oracle's denials that this discussion took place, despite the fact that at some point Katz apparently was so alarmed by this discussion that she complained to a bunch of people about it. Huh? Okay. Well, it's out there. It's interesting. We'll see whether anything comes of it. We got to catch up on a few other random pieces of news. I mentioned to you at the closing of the show yesterday that, yes, another woman has leveled accusations at Senator Al Franken, this time allegedly an incident in 2010 at the Minnesota State Fair, which quite honestly just doesn't seem... Well, none of this stuff really seems in character for most people, although it's more in character, I think, for some than others. I think, heavily repressed evangelical preachers and candidates, when you find out that they really were groping people, you kind of say, yeah, it sort of figures. Whereas with, a more enlightened seeming person like Franken, it really is kind of a surprise. Anyway, I grabbed, just by way of illustration, CNN's story on this by MJ Lee. Woman says Franken inappropriately touched her in 2010. Let's get a sense of what was going on here. A woman says Senator Al Franken inappropriately touched her in 2010, telling CNN that he grabbed her buttocks while taking a photo at the Minnesota State Fair. And I don't think that that's, in any way explicitly permitted, just by virtue of, paying your entry fee to the Minnesota State Fair. I think it's out of place. I don't know what it's like in Minnesota, but I'm pretty sure. It is the first allegation of improper touching by Franken, who is a Democrat, while he was in office. It comes just days after Leanne Tweeden, a local radio news anchor in California, said that Franken forcibly kissed and groped her in 2006 when Franken was a comedian. Franken has since issued an apology to Tweeden and faces a potential investigation by the Senate Ethics Committee. This new person, though, is Lindsay Menz, a 33-year-old woman who now lives in Frisco, Texas. She reached out to CNN on Thursday, hours after Tweeden made her story public. Menz said she wanted to share an uncomfortable interaction that left her feeling, quote, gross. According to Menz, she attended the Minnesota State Fair with her husband and father in the summer of 2010. Almost 2 years after Franken was elected to the Senate, I guess only 1 year since they finally let him into the Senate, too. Her father's small business was sponsoring a local radio booth, and she spent the day meeting various elected officials, political candidates, and celebrities and taking photos with them as they stopped by the booth. When Franken walked in, Menz and her husband, who also spoke with CNN, said they recognized him right away. Makes sense. Menz said she had a brief and cordial exchange with the senator. Then, as her husband held up her phone and got ready to snap a photo of the two of them, Franken, quote, pulled me in really close, like awkward close. And as my husband took the picture, he put his hand full-fledged on my rear, Menz said. It was wrapped tightly around my butt cheek. I always love these morning quotes. It wasn't around my waist. It wasn't around my hip or side. It was definitely on my butt, she said, recalling that the brazen act lasted 3 or 4 seconds. I was like, oh my God, what's happening? He reached around her and kind of pulled her into him, said her husband Jeremy Menz, who didn't see what happened behind his wife. He pulled her in and pushed his head against her head. It was over pretty quick. I will say, staging photos, if I know all of you have had your pictures taken probably by professional photographers at some point, and they do make you move in awkwardly close in a group photo. The photos do come out better if you stage them that way. They never told me to grab anybody's butt, of course, or that I had to be okay with my butt being grabbed. That seems superfluous. So I don't know what to tell you about this. I will tell you this. It doesn't make any sense, but then it didn't make any sense when we heard that, George H.W. Bush was doing it, as well. Even though they came up with the stupid excuse of, well, he's in a wheelchair and he's very weak and he can't lift his arms very high. He told the, rather bizarre David Copperfield joke. And I think that sort of removes a lot of the doubt. No joke told here. And I mean, it's pretty early in his career. And that's why it doesn't make any particular sense. He seems like the kind of person who would be embarrassed by being caught doing such a thing and therefore would not do it. Whereas many of the other people who end up getting accused don't seem to suffer any serious embarrassment about it. I don't know. I mean, I like to say I'm inclined to believe, the senator in all of this, but I guess you got to take all these things seriously, even though this doesn't make any particular sense. What does make sense? I mean, not very much of what's going on these days. For instance, we now have, of course, the report. You will all by now be well aware of the reports that deeply researched and sourced allegations revealed yesterday about Charlie Rose and a long history of sexual harassment and predation that is also very weird and also doesn't make any particular sense. But, well, I guess once a longer pattern is alleged, maybe, I mean, if there were 20 people saying, yeah, every time I took my picture with Al Franken, he grabbed my butt, I guess I'd say, well, that doesn't make any sense, but maybe he's just one of those weird guys that doesn't understand what the hell he's doing. Well, he's not. He seems like such a smart guy. I mean, but so did Charlie Rose, I guess. And that didn't seem to help him at all. Also, Glenn Thrush under the gun. Slightly different situation. And I guess, I'm not going to go into the specifics of those accusations. I think we'll stick to it when it's a politician and, one of the initial and more bizarre stories. I'm willing to indulge some of this stuff. Charlie Rose, honestly, I don't know what to do. Who cares? I mean, in terms of whether we retain Charlie Rose, he's never been of interest to me. Neither is Al Franken a huge hero of mine or anything. I just don't really regard any politicians or political or public figures that way, although he comes a lot closer, certainly, than Charlie Rose. I have admired his work far more than Charlie Rose's, or Glenn Thrush, for that matter. But it's out there, and it's happening, and it continues, and I guess it's a good thing overall, and it makes you wonder. I mean, I guess at this point, the volume of accusations against, or the accusations against this volume of men makes me question everything, I guess. I mean, was I supposed to be doing this? Was one question that came across my mind yesterday. Obviously, that's not the case, but I'm astounded by how many people allegedly feel free to do this. Not because I was under any delusion that there weren't people who did it. I guess I just thought it was a smaller sub-segment of the population. And it appears to be a much larger segment, or at least a much larger segment of the famous population. And maybe that's the key. Anyway, it's out there. And is there any indication of what will come of this and whether this too will become a part of the ethics investigation? I don't really know, and I don't think that they have quite resolved this. And, it's troubling, that's for sure. And while allegations have surfaced over the last couple of days with respect to reasons why one might not necessarily take Leanne Tweeden's word at face value, I have seen no suggestion so far that Lindsay Menz has any such, questions about her background or where she might be coming from. Although I guess eventually, because we're talking about a politician, some may surface. There will be defenders. And I don't know, perhaps if it becomes just glaringly obvious that at least we would be out of the loop if we didn't pay attention to those allegations, and I guess we'll make mention of them. But other than that, I think at the moment, Lindsay Menz's accusations stand, and it may be just that I'm out of the loop in finding out exactly what's up with her. That has not been top priority for me, but we'll remain open to that possibility. Anyway, we'll see. Has there been any disgusting revelations about anybody else this morning being brought forward to us by Twitter? Not so far. But, well, okay. I think we're up to date on the commentary then on this. So let's move on to another of our important morning stories. One I didn't get to yesterday, but I knew I had around somewhere when we were discussing the Republican tax plan. Jonathan Chait also had a piece on this in New York Magazine. The Republican plan is the opposite of tax reform. Just another similar shot being taken here, but we'll round up as many of them as we can because it's really a horrific collection of just weird and inexplicable and disparate tax policy proposals all jammed together as though, as we read yesterday, to punish enemies and reward himself, that is to say Trump and his family and friends. Chait's take on it begins this way. The Senate tax cut bill contains, among other obnoxious features, a special tax break for the owners of private planes. We've long had such a tax break, but interesting that they would expand this in this particular bill. There is a federal excise tax on private travel on the books, but the new tax would exempt storage, maintenance, and fueling, and those related to its operations, such as the, operations or other expenses related to its operations, such as the hiring and training of pilots and crew, as well as administrative services such as scheduling, flight planning, weather forecasting, obtaining insurance, and establishing and complying with safety standards, among other things. Rather than treat these costs as consumption, these Senate Republicans are exempting them as necessities of life. What are these people supposed to do, after all? Fly commercial like animals? I think not. The tax breaks for private planes is the sort of provision that is usually held up as a case for what tax reform is needed to eliminate. In this case, it is being created by tax reform. That is one clue that this tax reform plan being drawn up in Congress is nothing of the sort. The goal of a tax reform plan, as the term has been historically understood, has been to minimize political interference in the tax code. The tax code might charge a rich person a higher rate than a poor person, but it doesn't want to charge a butcher who earns $50,000 more than a baker who earns $50,000 just because the baker did a better job lobbying Congress. There are legitimate questions about how to define income. Traditionally, if you give money to charity, it's assumed that money is not part of your income, since you can't consume it. The same assumption is applied to money paid to state and local governments and taxes. Republicans want to make at least some of that money taxable. Conveniently, that means states with higher property and income taxes, which happen to be blue states, would get hit by this tax change. The most overt use of pseudo-reform to inflict punishment on blue America is a combination of punitive assaults on universities, we discussed a lot of that yesterday, which have grown increasingly hostile to the Republican Party over the last generation as the GOP has embraced anti-intellectualism. Both chambers would tax university endowments, an amazing policy choice given that Republicans generally oppose taxing other forms of concentrated wealth. Why should the assets of a non-profit educational institution be treated as income? It's hard to think of a reason other than the fact that Republicans don't like those institutions. Even more absurd is the provision in the House tax cut to treat graduate students' subsidized tuition as income. A graduate student who teaches and conducts research full-time for a university and who currently gets free tuition would be taxed on the full value of that tuition as if it were cash salary. We discussed that yesterday as well. For constituents Republicans wish to reward rather than punish, the tax bill's assumptions grow outlandishly generous. They would open up a massive loophole for business owners by creating a 25% tax rate for pass-through businesses, that is, businesses whose profits are taxed as personal income of their owners. Trump's businesses would be taxed this way. Since the Republican plan would leave individual income tax rates at least 10 percentage points higher than the pass-through rate, it would create enormous incentives for gaming. Rich people would figure out ways to categorize their income as a business they own. The proposed special rate for pass-throughs, a key feature of both bills, has the potential to become the single greatest inducement to tax arbitrage ever enacted by a single Congress, writes tax professor Daniel Shaviro. If you thought I was crazy by posing on Twitter as David Waldman LLC, you'll begin to see that I'm crazy like a fox, damn it. Although I didn't really incorporate. But basically, you should the sovereign citizens are going to end up being right in all this. Everybody should just incorporate as themselves incorporated and say that it's a company that's in the business of dispersing cash to you. All income from whatever work you personally perform should be imputed to this pass-through corporation, the job of which, and you're the CEO of that corporation, so you can tell whether you're doing a good job. The job of which is to turn money over to you when you need it. Basically, you can pose as your own ATM. I give myself cash when warranted, and that's the job I'm engaged in at David Waldman LLC, which needs to be taxed at the 25% rate, not the 35% rate you would tax me if I was just David Waldman, period. David Waldman LLC gets lower taxes, you see. Tax arbitrage, in case you were wondering, means a business deal that exists solely to take advantage of favorable tax law. It's use of money that makes no economic sense of its own. Shaviro has been quickly devising simple tax arbitrage schemes that the Republican bill would open up. His simplest example would exploit the bill's proposal to allow immediate expensing of investments combined with a rate cut that would take effect a year later. Suppose a company has the opportunity to spend $100 in 2018 in order to earn $90 in 2019, he suggests. So it faces a 10% loss before tax. But if it can expense the outlay at a 35% rate and include the receipt at a 20% rate, then after tax, it's out only $65 in 2018 and retains $72 in 2019. Voila! Profitable after-tax investment. That seemed a little more complicated than I think they intended, but it perhaps makes more sense in writing. A well-designed tax reform would take multiple times as long, I guess, many times longer to write as the Republicans are allotting themselves. In other words, the quick movement of this bill is a pretty good hint that they didn't do a good job with it, that it's poorly designed. The Tax Reform Act of 1986, for instance, began 2 years earlier. The Republicans are rushing their plan through Congress in weeks in order, in part, to avoid the potential loss of a Senate vote in Alabama, and in part because they understand that extended public debate and scrutiny of their already unpopular plan would only subject them to more public backlash. In such a compressed period of time, they couldn't avoid opening up enormous opportunities for gaming and arbitrage, even if they wanted to. And there's little reason to believe they want to, with their plan essentially having been created by and for the business lobby. The tax code is imperfect now. Once the Republicans get through with it, it will be in desperate need of reform. Okay, well, then they can have a second go at it. I'm sure that's probably part of the thinking as well. Let's see. Other items that we might want to include before the close of our first hour here. Well, there was an interesting tweet here I grabbed from Brian Beutler yesterday. This was an interesting thought. He was reacting to a tweet from Dean Clancy, who had this to say. The D.C. rumor mill was who he was crediting with this idea. Hill Republicans are plotting to abolish the debt ceiling and instead automatically increase the national debt level, the cap, I guess, with each new spending bill. Did you know that they were thinking of such a thing? And Brian's thoughts on it, I think, probably mesh with Armando's in a way on this. He says, Trump is overwhelmingly bad, but he creates the space for some positive developments. It is kind of nutty that we keep insisting on raising the debt ceiling incrementally every time we run up against the limit, as opposed to simply saying, look, we have a sovereign fiat currency at this point. We just create more debt. It's going to happen, and we're not going to default on our bonds and other obligations, and so we should just admit it and move forward and make it automatic. And in a way, that's actually something that makes a great deal of sense. I thought I'd toss that one out there just to be part of the record. Let's see, other interesting items that we might be able to sort of fit in there before we leave off. Let's see. Well, there's not that much here, but let me at least take note of, if not read the article on, an interesting development from out of the UK. We all have had our suspicions about Russian interference in their latest trips to the polls, and so therefore the question of the British exit or Brexit from the European Union. But I guess it stretches a little further back even than that. This a piece in the Times of London, barrage of tweets on independence linked to Russia. They're talking here about the Scottish independence vote. Almost 400,000 Twitter messages about Scottish independence were posted by fake accounts most believed to be Russian. This takes things back a little bit, doesn't it? Researchers say that hundreds of automated accounts, so-called Twitter bots, pumped out messages about independence issues over an 18-month period. Experts said it was likely that many, if not most, of the bots were linked to Russian attempts to disrupt democracy in Western Europe. Spikes in activity from the computer-generated social media accounts coincided with major Scottish events. Yes, major Scottish events. That's right. Including Nicola Sturgeon announcing plans to hold a second independence referendum. Very interesting. I think we had our suspicions about Brexit, but I don't know that we were aware of it going further back to even to Scottish independence referenda. Okay, we'll have Armando join us, and we'll take our break and be back with our big debate. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We are joined now for the big debate as we'll fade our music back out, and we're going to go without our bottom of the hour break so that we're not interrupted in our discussion. We are joined right now by Armando, who you all are familiar with, the long-time listeners to the show, Armando Llorens. And
hello, everybody.
There you are. Hey, Armando. Ben Spielberg, also with us, blogger from, right now you're blogging at 3forjustice.com, where you've been writing since, I believe you told me, 2013. You're a long-time online participant and an activist for social justice. And the two of you have, let's see, if I have the background right, and I missed the beginning of this whole experiment. But I know that I don't know, Armando, basically where you would have been spending your time online in Twitter world. Anyway, discussing the proposed reforms at the DNC and the results of the work of the Unity Commission. And Ben, I guess, I don't know who engaged who first in all of this, or do you even recall? Armando, what's your recollection? I took issue with
some things that Ben had written, but I think Ben can tell you his point of view, and I know that in the follow-up we'll have links to his articles explaining his issues with the way the 2016 primary was conducted and what he suggests we should do for 2020. And I'll respond to what he has to say.
Yeah, why don't we begin with Ben? Since, like I said, you cheated and rigged the whole thing yesterday.
Exactly.
By coming on and previewing things and then proceeding into the debate. But why don't we begin then with Ben? I'm just going to kind of leave it open, Ben, and you can, by way of if you want to start again with introduction or not, if you think it's been sufficient, we'll let you dive in and make an opening statement. It's going to be pretty free form. I don't foresee any serious moderation or imposition of any rules and regulations here.
That sounds great. And thank you so much for having me on. Thank you, Armando, for setting this up. I really appreciate it. I think a lot of times Twitter gets a lot of flack for unproductive conversation. I think initially Armando and I had somewhat unproductive back and forth, but I think that this is somewhat of the potential for the medium where you can start out that way, but then start having a much more productive conversation about areas where I think Armando and I actually may have some common ground on things we'd like to see moving forward. So I'm really excited about having this conversation. Just in terms of, I guess, framing, I hope that we can spend most of our time on kind of what things we'd like to see changed moving forward. But I do want to give the context for our original discussion and what we did discuss, which maybe we'll delve into a little bit more. So the 2016 primary, I think there's this whole narrative and debate about whether or not it was quote unquote rigged. And I think that word can often be a distraction from what you're actually talking about. And so the piece that Armando is referencing, I wrote last year, right around the end of the primary. And I called it, there's a reason people think the Democratic primary was undemocratic and unfair. It was. And I said, a lot of the people who are saying the primary wasn't quote unquote rigged make some important points, but there are also very legitimate reasons people have a problem with how the Democratic primary unfolded. And I wanted to explain what those were and why I think they're important. And so what I would do to kind of frame this discussion is divide things into two categories. One is, I think, this concept of were there undemocratic aspects of the way the Democratic primary played out, and in fact, in the way the Democratic Party has long run its process, and are those a problem? And I think my sense is that we'll probably agree to some extent that the answer to that question is yes. My hope is it is, because I don't think there's too much debate around that question. I think the secondary question that often gets conflated when you talk about the problems with the Democratic primary is, would it have made a difference in terms of the outcome of the election? And I did write in my piece, and I think it's true that you could argue maybe, ultimately it's unknowable, but I actually think that question is less important for this discussion than just the question of, were there problems? Do they represent an issue for people who believe that voting systems should be as open as possible, as democratic as possible, that voters should have as much information as possible to make informed decisions and as much ability to actually go out and vote? So ideally, and I mean, again, Armando, I'm open to discussing whatever you want to, but I think it's probably less productive to talk about, do those issues with the primary, did they make an ultimate difference in the outcome, but more talk about kind of what are some of the issues and then what do we think we should do to change them. And then hopefully talk a little bit about what voting reforms the Democratic Party should be pushing generally if we believe in this goal of getting the voting process as representative, informed, and democratic as possible.
And everybody who knows me knows that I have sharp words, sometimes sharper than are deserved, and I'll cop to being a little sharp with you on Twitter. But I'm glad that we've gotten to this spot. Whatever happened in 2016, you're right. Let's put that aside. We can argue about that on Twitter. We've got an hour here. Let's look forward. The Democratic National Committee at the 2016 convention passed a resolution to form what's called the Unity and Reform Commission. It was passed on July 23rd, 2016. It called for the naming of a 21-person commission. The chairperson is Jen O'Malley Dillon, designated by Hillary Clinton. Larry Cohen, the former head of the Communication Workers of America Union, designated by Bernie Sanders. Clinton has named another 9 members, and Sanders named another 7. So Clinton has 10, Sanders had 8, and Tom Perez, who was the elected DNC chair in fairly controversial fashion in January or February, I forget the exact month, named the other 3. So this 21-person commission has been holding sessions all over the country, in Chicago and Las Vegas, and I believe, I can't remember where the third one was, but they've had third, and now they're going to have a fourth, and this is the big one. On December 8th and 9th, they will propose and presumably decide what recommendations they are going to make. They are charged by the mandate to look at a number of things, but in terms of the nomination process, they are to consider, and I'll quote here, the Unity and Reform Commission shall consider and make appropriate recommendations regarding revisions to the delegate selection rules for the 20 Democratic National Convention with respect to the manner of voting used during the presidential nominating process, with a goal of increasing voter participation and inclusion through grassroots engagement of the party's voter base during and in between presidential election cycles. I happen to find, this is me now, that statement to be gobbledygook. If they had just stopped at increasing voter participation, then I would have said okay, but then you throw in this grassroots, and that seems like a stop to caucuses. Caucuses are an issue here. And it's important to realize what this resolution says, man. It says the commission, and I quote again, the commission shall make recommendations to encourage the expanded use of primary elections. Currently, there are two ways that state parties choose delegates for nomination process. Primaries, the variety of primaries that are held, open, closed, mixed, etc. And those are decided by the state government. For example, in the state of Florida, which is controlled by Republicans, the elections are closed primaries. That is, only people who are registered in the party vote in the primaries. It's not just for presidential elections. It's for every single primary election that Florida holds. By contrast, Wisconsin, also controlled by Republicans, has a history of allowing and that's what is de facto an open primary. You can change your registration the day of. You can change it back the day after. If you're a Republican, you can pretend to be a Democrat for a day. If you're an independent, you can pretend to be a Republican for a day, etc. Those are primaries. And the merits of open versus closed, I'll say for letter, I don't have as strong an opinion on it as I think you do, Ben. And David, I think, has some opinions on that. I don't have as strong an opinion on it. But I do have an opinion on primaries over caucuses. It is irrefutable that primaries are much better for permitting voter participation than caucuses. It's not arguable. We have the tangible proof. And I will reach into 2016 to make my point. In Washington State, the state Democratic Party held a caucus, a closed caucus, as a matter of fact. And the reason they held a closed caucus is they did not like that the state government of Washington, controlled by Democrats, was holding an open primary. So they chose their delegates to the convention using a closed caucus. A closed caucus which Bernie Sanders dominated. Indeed, it was his best state, and it wasn't even close. He gained net 50 delegates in the Washington caucuses. A few weeks after that, the state of Washington held an open primary. Hillary Clinton won that open primary by 6 points. If the delegates had been selected using the primary, and by the way, that primary drew in excess of 3 times the voters that the closed caucus did in Washington. Now, I know there's explanations, but I use that example because it's actually something that the DNC and the Unity Reform Commission can do something about right now. That is, if a state holds a primary, the state party should be required to honor the results of the primary and not hold a caucus, because a caucus is institutional voter suppression. It simply is, and we know it because by magnitudes, the number of people who vote in primaries is much greater than people who vote in caucuses, including the best caucuses. the wonderful Paeans to Democracy caucuses like the Iowa caucus.
So
They
Armando,
do not come close to approaching that. I'll stop for a second because I think you have something to say.
Yeah, well, so I just wanted to jump in for a second to say I totally agree with you about caucuses versus primaries. And in my piece, one of the things that I noted that I think is fair from the people who rebut claims of a quote-unquote rigged primary is that caucuses are undemocratic, and that was actually one aspect of the democratic system that did favor Bernie Sanders. You're absolutely right. Caucuses, he did much better in those typically than he did in primaries. And that is something I think that's important to take note of when we're discussing the issues with the 2016 primary. I would say in terms of the Washington state results, I do think one complicating factor is people did know the caucus was the one that quote unquote counted and the primaries did not. But I think that you're absolutely right that there was a huge problem there and that the primary should be the result that we go with when we have the choice of those two. And I, in general, think caucuses should be abolished, especially when we don't have an election day national holiday for people to actually get there and participate.
I think the issue of caucuses is more complex than that. It's simply because some states, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, they're not holding primaries, and there's nothing the DNC can do to make them do it. And that goes to the issue of open and closed primaries, too. You cannot force these states to do it your way. You and I will talk about things that the DNC can do. We could talk about it now, but I was thinking we'd talk about it later because I wanted to go through the general mandate that the Unity and Reform Commission has. Because a second mandate is, and I want to quote again from the resolution, it says that, and I quote here, that where states, the commission shall make specific recommendations regarding the steps necessary to ensure that in states where caucuses are conducted, eligible voters' ability to participate in the caucuses are protected. The commission shall make recommendations as to how caucuses can be less burdensome and more inclusive, transparent, and accessible to participants. Specific consideration shall be given to the so-called firehouse caucuses. I'll stop here for a second. Firehouse caucuses are intended to make caucuses as much like primaries as possible. To wit, you'd have multiple locations. You can never have a number of locations you'll have at a state primary election. It's just not possible. But at least the idea is to create a 9 to 5 opportunity for people to just come and drop off their vote, etc. Myself is they should consider mail-in caucuses when possible. At any rate, the idea is to make the rules for caucuses not the Iowa rules, which are you have to be there for 2 or 3 hours. You have to go stand in corners. You got to reallocate if you don't get 15%. We want to eliminate that. Why? Because it disenfranchises voters, in my opinion. So the mandate is to eliminate that as much as possible as well. The third thing that they are going to look at is the question of superdelegates. And here, if you look at Section 3, there's actually a very specific, frankly, recommendation in the resolution itself, which is to make elected officials, and let me read it so instead of my characterization of it. This is Section 3 of the resolution. It says that the Unity Reform Commission shall consider and make appropriate recommendations for revisions to the delegate selection rules for the 2020 Democratic National Convention to provide for a change in the manner by which unpledged party leader and elected official delegates participate in the presidential nominating process. This is the recommendation. In particular, the Commission shall make specific recommendations providing that members of Congress, governors, and distinguished party leaders, and those are defined under the DNC charter already, shall remain unpledged and free to support their nominee of choice, but the remaining unpledged delegates be required to cast their vote at the convention for candidates in proportion to the vote received for each candidate in their state. Myself, I would eliminate all voting superdelegates.
Oh, great. We agree on that.
That would be my belief. This recommendation allows elected officials to remain unpledged. Ben, I know you have a lot to say about this, and David, I think you do too.
I do, but let's have Ben do it.
Well, so I mean, I wanted to say that seems like another issue that we agree on, so that's great. And
two.
just to take a step back for a second, I was going to say kind of the four things that I outlined from a Democratic Party standpoint that I think were a problem with 2016 and the way the Democratic Party does operate these primaries. There's also some things I wrote about which are not really Democratic Party apparatus problems necessarily per se. They're kind of more media problems, Democratic organization problems, and there's an interaction effect, I think, with the party with those issues. But I think it makes sense for us to focus on the party now. I just want to note those because I think that they're also an important part of the discussion when looking back on why people are upset about 2016. But
I don't want to steer you yet, but I was thinking we talk about the voting issues, including inside the primaries and outside. If you're able to stay for the second half of the discussion after 10:30, Ben, I actually had asked you for 10 to 10:30, but we blocked off the hour if you're available for the whole hour.
I should be. I think I should be free. So let's plan on doing that. So in terms of the
super
voting,
delegates.
Yeah, in terms of the Democratic issues. So I just want to mention, you've already mentioned open versus closed primaries, caucuses, super delegates, and then the fourth thing that I would just throw out there is I do think some enforceable mechanism for violations of the bylaws when you have kind of bylaws that do say you were supposed to be neutral. There's got to be some, I think, dispute mechanism, A, for dealing with those violations, and B, trying to ensure that moving forward you do actually have a neutral process. In terms of the voting stuff on superdelegates, I 100% agree that you should get rid of them because I think that if you are calling yourself the Democratic Party, you want to run a process where it really is the will of the voters that's determining the nominee. And even though superdelegates typically do end up siding with the will of the voters anyway, because they're included in delegate totals at the outset, because there is the possibility that they'd override the will of the voters, it really does look kind of like a process that the party may want to overturn the general process that everybody else goes through. So I am 100% in agreement on both eliminating superdelegates, eliminating caucuses. And I don't know if David, if you want to comment on that first, we can talk about open versus closed primaries later if you want.
Well, no, I will express it. I've had great difficulty in understanding the apparent disagreement that, I don't know, this seems to be a pall cast over the discussion when there's this disagreement over caucuses. And now in looking and of course in listening to what you have explained, but for some time now, I've had great difficulty finding Bernie Sanders supporters actually saying that they were in favor of caucuses as traditionally formulated. I don't know how we ended up spending so much time in apparent disagreement over it, and we seems to have solved it here quickly.
I'll have to address that because it's not Bernie Sanders supporters that worry me. It's Bernie Sanders delegates to the Unity and Reform Commission.
Okay.
And their support for caucuses has been manifest. They have defended caucuses to the death. Anybody who says a bad word about them, and I'm talking about people I've engaged with, David, 3 particular members who were active on Twitter with me. Well, actually, one just decided that she didn't want to engage me. That would be Namaki Konst, the TYT reporter who was designated by Sanders. But more specifically, James Zogby has been an incredible defender of caucuses. He is a Sanders delegate to this. And Jane Fleming Klebb, who is the chairman of the Nebraska Democratic Party, and her point of view is particularly important and troubling for me because Nebraska also had a caucus and ignored an open primary in 2016. So this is not something that I've invented out of my head. It is coming from the Bernie Sanders delegates to the Unity and Reform Commission. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
What are their arguments?
Their arguments are party building.
I am surprised. I mean, there's certainly a distinction to be made between delegates to the committee and Sanders supporters in general. Do we have any idea that they been able to influence the report that will be issued?
We'll know on December 8th and December 9th, I assume. Remember, the big...
To hear Nomiki...
I'm going to take it aside. Nomiki is how you say it? I always say it wrong.
Well, yeah, I could be saying it wrong, too. But, I mean, they're people I follow and I generally like a lot, so I'd be curious to hear them explain what their views are, and I'd love to hear more about it from them. But generally speaking, I think caucuses should be eliminated. So
Ben, that's not what they're saying. That's not what they're saying at all. I'll be perfectly honest. The reason why they're not saying it, in my view, is because caucuses are good for Bernie Sanders, and that's fine. If that's your role in this Unity and Reform Commission, which is to defend the interests of Bernie Sanders, and okay, you're defending the interests of Bernie Sanders. Let's be clear about it. You're not interested in unifying the Democratic Party. You're not interested in...
I lost you.
Yeah, I can't hear.
Interests.
He's coming back in. Okay, well, fair enough. At least I think I've cleared up where the confusion is coming from, and these folks are just plain not here to make that argument. It wouldn't be fair to have Ben represent that. It doesn't believe it.
No, I agree. I was responding to your
No, I have that question, and I'll address it to people who actually hold that position instead. And at this point, I'll bow back out and let's move on.
Well, I thought you were going to defend superdelegates, Dave.
I could do it, but again, I will say each time I've done it, I'm not married to the proposition. I merely I have in thinking about superdelegates in the past found, well, one, they have never really been all that influential. The biggest knock on them is, of course, their ability to support candidates early and to use their positions of influence, which, and part of my defense, they're granted that position of influence by virtue of having been elected to that position of influence, and presumably they have some sense of the pulse of where their constituencies are, and they speak out early in exercise of their First Amendment rights to simply back a candidate that they prefer. And if their constituents who have believed them and supported them in the past choose to believe them and support them again in the future, I don't really find that typically awfully undemocratic. But again, it's not a concept I'm married to, and I certainly don't think that the outcome of a nominating process would be undemocratic without them. So that leaves the door open for some experimentation. But I've never found the fact that superdelegates as human beings have preferences and like to express them and have risen to the position of superdelegate by virtue of their ability to persuade their constituents of the wisdom of their positions a very troubling thing. I find it's just, that's democracy in action, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But
so I guess what I would say is I think many of them are elected officials, and certainly in that capacity as elected officials, they should feel free to speak out for whoever they wish. I think the issue with the superdelegate system is that position counts equivalently to delegates that are allocated based on the vote. And when media organizations are reporting on the status of the primary election, they typically bunch together the superdelegate and delegate totals in a way that does not explain that the superdelegate totals are not set in stone until the end of the process, and that those are really just the opinions of individuals who are elected party officials in other contexts. And so I think for people who are looking at the race, it creates the false conception that one candidate may not have a chance early on. When people are forming their opinions, it may lead to less research on the candidate who looks like they don't have a chance. And ultimately, again, the superdelegates, if it's going to be a fully democratic process, would vote with the public. And so their existence is at best superfluous and seems to me to be something that at most is meant to circumvent the choice the voters end up making.
Yeah. To me,
can I ask you a question on that? Because I actually think that even if you are for...
You're fading in and out there, Armando.
Yeah.
Don't
I
move.
Can't hear. No, sorry.
It's created, and rightly so. And frankly, if you want to take the Clinton perspective on this, it was the existence of superdelegates that permitted Bernie Sanders not to concede. at the end of the primaries. If there had been no superdelegates, there really was no argument for him to not concede the day after the California primary. It was over.
Yep.
It was over.
Yep.
And I think that to make the argument to the Clinton people, you wouldn't have had the month of June and early July where Bernie was saying what he was saying or doing what he was doing, because he would have had no excuse to not concede. He had lost. In fact, you don't even need a concession. The votes were over. So, but let me ask the question for Ben to hear, because, okay, we take away their vote, but they're still going to endorse. Or do you have something in mind where they don't get to endorse?
Well, no. So this goes to the other point I was making, which is some of the problems have less to do with specific reforms you can make through the DNC and more to do with kind of how Democratic Party organizations, media institutions, and Democratic Party officials conduct themselves. I think any elected official should feel free to endorse who they want to endorse, and that if you get rid of superdelegates, you have much less of a problem there. I think some of the other problems we saw early on in the primary was folks who were ostensibly more neutral, or folks who were ostensibly representing large groups of members, making decisions that either A, were not neutral, and so that wasn't fully transparent to people, or you had organizations making endorsements without polling their membership, when their membership may have had a different perspective on what they would have liked to do or would have benefited from more information about the candidates, in a way that led to an early setup and primary process that favored one candidate over another. So I think you're right that people need to be able to speak out about what their opinions are. I just think if you have an organization that's supposed to be kind of a Democratic membership organization, or you're a media figure that is not writing as kind of an official campaign surrogate, and you're writing in your capacity as kind of a journalist, I think it's very important to, one, be very attuned to the facts, and two, to be cognizant of the democratic process and how your approach plays into the democratic process. But that's something that DNC reforms can't solve. It's more an appeal to members of those community to think about how they influence democracy and why people might have been upset about their behavior.
Yeah. Ben, let me ask you on that point, and in the next half hour we'll switch over to the voting reforms issues that you want to talk about. But in terms of setting the stage and the early favoring of it, particularly with the superdelegates and the creation of an inevitability, et cetera, do you have any thoughts on the way the calendar itself is set up? For years, by tradition, since 1976, Iowa and New Hampshire have gone first.
Yep.
Iowa and New Hampshire are very white. Iowa has a caucus, which is undemocratic, as I've expressed before. New Hampshire is 95% white. It doesn't really reflect the Democratic Party's membership. Should we not be looking at the calendar to be more representative of the entire party?
Yeah, so I think this is a third issue we agree on. It's something that I'm not sure about in terms of should we just do them all at the same time. I can see an argument for that, having a longer primary season and then, the same length primary season, but all the elections happen at the same time. The argument against it is maybe it's difficult for insurgent candidates to build momentum, quote unquote. But I think the argument for it is you're not privileging any one state's vote over another's, which seems important to me. So I definitely could see the argument for doing that. I think at least what you should do, this argument about tradition to me is absurd. I think the baseline change that we should have is some sort of random lottery among the states that determines the order, so that you don't privilege any one state in perpetuity over another, especially, as you said, the states we currently privilege are not representative of the general American public.
Well, we're agreeing too much, but maybe we'll start disagreeing here in the second half. David, sorry for taking over your moderator role. But
no, I'm not trying to play
Ben
one.
wants to get to the issue of the voting processes and, frankly, beyond the primary situation, what we should be arguing for in terms of voting reform. So, Ben, why don't you set that stage?
Sure. So, I mean, the one last thing to talk about in terms of the Democrats, which we just kind of glossed over, is the open versus closed issue. But I think that plays into, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But that, to me, plays into the broader question. So there's a great piece, and I think I may have sent this to you during our conversation, that was written in Jacobin the day after the election, called The Blueprint for a New Party. It was by Seth Ackerman. And I thought he did a really good job of laying out in that piece what the issues are with the American electoral system being a two-party system and it being very difficult to have a viable third party in the American electoral system because of systems that the Democrats and Republicans have joined together to enact in American law to put up barriers to other parties entering the process. And so the reason that I think this plays into...
I'm actually curious about that.
Yeah, no, we should definitely talk about that. But and
all right, we'll finish your thought. I apologize. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So what I was going to say is the reason I think this plays into open versus closed primaries is I think the argument for open primaries is this is a less restrictive system and it allows more people to participate in the process, and we should do it for that reason because we believe in more democracy and because if you don't do that, then there are certain people who are locked out of a process that selects one of the two people who really has a shot at becoming the major party nominee. I think the argument against it, some people say, is, well, why should you get to participate in the primary process of an organization that you don't belong to and have no interest in belonging to? And what my response typically is the question we have before us is, do we focus solely on making the two-party system the most representative system it can possibly be within this construct? Or do we say, well, it's fine if the Democratic Party is a private organization that enforces private rules and kind of is very stringent about the procedures it has for people to participate in its process. But if we do that and we also believe in democracy, we really need to dismantle the Democratic and Republican Party stranglehold on the electoral system. And so what I would say is, if you don't support open primaries, it's hard for me to understand how you would not support some of the voting reforms I want to talk about to make the system more accessible for the large number of Americans who do not identify as Democrats or Republicans.
Let me take on the role. I don't feel that strongly about open versus closed as most people do, but I'm going to take the role of arguing the other side.
Right.
When you talk about the viability of third parties, and I look at a state like New York, which Bernie Sanders has called out specifically as being undemocratic in its system. New York has a closed primary system, and it has an unusually long time for changing parties before a primary, any primary. It's close to 6 months. I believe it's 5 months. And that sounds outrageous and long, but you can register up to 25 days before the election if you haven't registered. But to change your party, let's say you're in the Working Families Party, which is a registered party in New York. The Greens are also a registered party in New York. And you wanted to vote in a Democratic primary, you can't because you registered and you didn't make the change in time because you're a member of the Working Families Party. But the idea of requiring it is as much, frankly, to support the parties that aren't the two major parties, so they can defend their lines on the ballot. Because without membership, without people voting for under that line, those parties disappear. If New York eliminated party registration, there would be no Working Families Party, in my opinion. There would be no Green Party having a line on the ballot. Now, maybe there shouldn't be a line. I'm actually someone who thinks that the American system has actually pretty much decided that we have two big vats to argue our different points of view. If you are an environmentalist and you thought the Green Party spoke to you, you're going to have to convince the Democratic Party to agree with you to have a real meaningful impact on policy. But what about that argument that, in fact, having closed primaries and closed registration is actually the only way to actually empower third and fourth parties? What do you think of that, Ben?
Yeah, so I do not think that argument is very strong, in part because I don't think that's why the Democratic Party has those rules. And I also think that if you really do want to empower third parties, there are a variety of other reforms you can enact which are much, much better at doing that, aren't really theoretical like that one, but would tangibly help third parties participate in the process. So I don't think that that is a very strong position. And actually, the Working Families Party is an interesting case because they actually pursue a method that's a little bit more along the lines of what Seth Ackerman is talking about, because you can vote for a Democratic candidate under the Working Family Party's line.
You can. That's absolutely true. In a general election.
Yeah. So, right. So, yeah, I don't find that particularly compelling. And I guess what I would say is I think of voter suppression as a spectrum. This is something, it's an argument Matt Brunig made in a post that I thought was pretty good after the new. Just saying that, again, if we believe in fully representative processes, it's not really great for us to say, well, that other thing is voter suppression. Having voter ID laws is voter suppression, but making people switch their party registration several months before the primary process if they want to participate in the process that, for all intents and purposes, is likely going to result in the next president, or one of the next two people who has a chance of being a presidential nominee. That's also voter suppression. It's not as bad, but it's still on the spectrum, because what you really you want to make it as easy as possible for anybody to show up and vote without any restrictions whatsoever. Because, the reality is people are super busy. Low-income people of color have way more barriers to participating in the voting process than people who are more affluent and who typically are white. And so I think that we just really want to make sure, the Democratic Party really wants to make sure and should want to make sure that there are as few barriers to voting as possible.
Well, let's talk about this question, though, on the registration, because the DNC resolution that created the Unity and Reform Commission resolved further, and I quote, that the Unity and Reform Commission shall make recommendations to encourage the involvement in all elections of unaffiliated or new voters who seek to join the Democratic Party, including through same-day registration and re-registration. So, at least from reading the resolution, the idea here seems to be is to encourage the ability to register as a Democrat up into the day of the election. Is that sufficient for what you're looking for, or are you looking for more than that?
I think same-day registration mostly solves the problem. Ideally, I would prefer that not to be the case, and just partially to give you context on my own personal preferences. I'm a registered Democrat in D.C., but I'm only a registered Democrat because you have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the primary, and so if I didn't know that, I wouldn't be a registered Democrat in D.C. When I lived in California,
Ben, I can't hear Ben now at this point.
Yeah, Ben, you back?
Yeah.
There he is.
Yes.
Okay, we lost you for a second, but now you're back.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just saying I'm a registered Democrat in D.C., but only because I want to be able to vote in the primary. If I didn't know that I had to be a Democrat to vote in the primary in D.C. or didn't care about voting in the primary, I wouldn't be a registered Democrat because I do have a lot of issues with the Democratic Party, but I want to be able to participate in those processes. And I do think people shouldn't have to participate in a process that is very impactful on who your elected officials are going to be, have to join an organization that they're not crazy about, ideally. At the same time, same-day registration, does it really matter if you show up and you register as a Democrat so you can vote in the primary? You could always change it back later. I don't think that's as big a deal, and I think it mostly solves the problem. But what I would really like to see, and kind of what I would hope the Democratic Party would push for, is we do have this system, again, that is so stacked against other parties kind of participating in the process. And I would love to see the Democratic Party push for a really robust system of public financing for the general election that's accessible for other parties, the removal of many of the ballot access restrictions that make it really hard for third-party candidates to get on the ballot and makes third parties spend a lot of time trying to do petition drives to get on the ballot, which doesn't really exist as an obstacle in most other countries. I'd love to see kind of the Democratic Party push ranked choice voting in the general election to get rid of the spoiler concern. And I would love to see, general good government reforms of making it easier to vote, like making Election Day a national holiday, making, ideally it's a security issue, but making online voting possible. I think there was a whole set of reforms that can, beyond the DNC Unity Commission, that the Democratic Party, it is not in the interest of the Democratic Party as an institution to do this, but if its goal is to preserve itself as an institution, that is the only viable alternative to Republicans. But if its goal is to involve as many people as possible in the electoral process, I think politicians in the Democratic Party should be advocating for getting rid of barriers to debates, getting rid of barriers to third-party access, and for robust public financing.
Okay, I do question the one point that I still think is a little bit contradictory is the idea of third-party ballot access is, in my view, and maybe my knowledge is limited, but in New York, which has one of the most robust third-party ballot access, first of all, it's very difficult, but it's also enshrined, and a key part of that is closed primaries and closed elections. I mean, that's one thing I'd like to see you grapple with a little bit more, maybe a more study on it. But let's switch gears just slightly, because I think you and I have some thoughts that we may find some disagreement on, but mostly on what to use it on, which is what can the Democratic Party do to enforce its rules? What were your thoughts? You and I had talked about this a little bit before the call. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, sure. So I do just want to say very briefly, in terms of the barriers, I do think like requirements that you get a certain percentage of the vote in previous elections, or you get a whole host of signatures, is very restrictive. Because if you look at other countries, and again, this is in that Seth Ackerman article in Jacobin, in Canada, if you have 250 signed-up members, you can compete in all of the 338 House of Commons districts nationwide, and you just need 100 voter signatures. In the UK, a parliamentary candidate needs to submit 10 signatures, a £500 deposit, and that deposit is refunded if the candidate wins 5% of the vote. In Australia, if you have 500 members, you can run in all of the House of Representatives districts. You give a $770 deposit. It's refundable if the candidate wins at least 4% of the vote. So those restrictions are the barriers are very low in other countries that have these systems. And in the United States, they're really restrictive. A lot of times third-party candidates have to fight prolonged legal battles to get on the ballot in certain states and can't spend as much time doing this types of information outreach, participation in debates about policy that other candidates can. So I'll leave that to the side. But I did just want to note, I do think the barriers in the United States are atypically extraordinarily hard to overcome if you're a third-party candidate. In terms of what the DNC can do, so yeah, and I would love to hear more of your thoughts on this too, but I think we often underestimate the value of the bully pulpit and the value of threatening to pull money. So I think if the DNC said to state parties, we don't want any of you to run caucuses anymore, and we also don't want any of you to run a closed primary anymore. We want everything to be an open primary everywhere. I think they could say, if you don't do that, we are going to pull money from you. And we are also going to, go and talk to voters in your state and explain that you're being an impediment to the democratic process. I think you'd have states flip pretty quick if the DNC decided to do that.
That's interesting. Now, again, in terms of pulling money, I think kind of interesting and in a way counterintuitive. Isn't this sort of the idea of the establishment telling people what to do by saying, particularly with the use of money, I won't give you money if you don't do what I tell you? Is it just a question of, well, it's okay as long as they're telling the state parties to do what I want them to do, or the states to do what I want them to do? I mean, when is it wrong for the establishment, the DNC, to tell people what to do?
So I think it's wrong for an organization to pursue approaches that are undemocratic. So, and this is kind of how I see like the federal-state divide on policy issues too. I don't think it's inherently wrong for the federal government to tell state governments what to do. I don't think it's inherently wrong for the DNC to tell state parties what to do. What I think is wrong is for the federal government or the DNC to take a look at state organizations and say, we want you to do something undemocratic. I think if the federal government and the central organization for the Democrats want to pursue good government reforms and something that increases access to the ballot box, I think that those are things you absolutely should do. And the reason that you have a centralized organization is because a lot of states have horribly restrictive laws on the books. I mean, when you look at the Voting Rights Act, of that is, you needed a federal, some sort of federal law that overrode terrible practices in states.
I don't disagree with you, but let me actually put this in a concrete terms. The resolution that created the Unity and Reform Commission of 2016 says, and again, I'll quote, "The commission shall make recommendations to encourage the expanded use of primary elections." So if I were to propose that the DNC adopt a policy that said, if your state holds a caucus, we will cut your delegation by 50%. Would you agree with that?
We would do what to your delegation?
We would cut your delegation by 50%. So Iowa has a caucus.
Yeah.
And they have, 20 delegates or whatever. I'm going to reduce it to 10 because they're having a caucus. Would you agree to that?
That's interesting. I mean, I think I would prefer, again, saying the expectation is that you will do a primary instead of a caucus. And if you don't do that, we will take such measures as are necessary to persuade you to change to a primary. And maybe one of those would be pulling delegates. But I think rather than doing the fine or doing the measure up front, I think I might say, here's the expectation. And if you decide to go against it, we're going to take such measures as we deem necessary to encourage you to comply with the expectation.
Would it surprise you if I told you that the existing rules of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Commissions actually permits them to punish states that break their rules? Because it does, and they did it, and they used it in 2008. And they stripped all the delegates from Michigan and Florida until they finally came to an agreement after everything, when it didn't matter anymore. But they chose to do it. Of course, they also let New Hampshire break their rules, and they didn't punish them at all. Which, and by the way, who did all that was Donna Brazile at the time. It was quite an interesting fixing that she did at the time. But my point is the rules are there. People don't realize that. The question is, what are you going to use the rules for? What are you going to use that power to punish for? I believe the biggest strain, and we're down to 10 minutes, so we should wrap up our thoughts, is the following. The biggest blight, the biggest undemocratic voter disenfranchising aspect of the Democratic nomination process are caucuses. I think the evidence is irrefutable. I think any defense of caucuses is unacceptable and, frankly, disgraceful. The mandate for the URC says that and it says it in its first resolution, paragraph of the resolution, that the use of primary elections shall be encouraged. There are three easy things to do that should not be controversial. Number one, in a state where the state government holds a primary, a state party is prohibited from holding a caucus. That means Washington State and Nebraska right now. Number two, if a state does not hold a primary and it has a caucus, then everything possible to allow as much voter participation as possible in the, quote, caucus, unquote, should be required, be it firehouse caucuses, mail-in, etc. Superdelegates are undemocratic and more trouble than they're worth. they should be stripped of their voting. That is my view of if the URC does those three things, it will be a successful reform effort. Ben, your last thoughts.
So I would say I agree with that. I would just friendly amend to they should make all primaries open and caucuses open, and hopefully I think exercise more weight with places that do not follow those recommendations and try to maintain caucuses or close primaries, and then really commit to taking more aggressive action on the violation of bylaws. But I think if you're able to do all of those things, one, I think a thing that's really helpful about it is that, as you mentioned, some of those issues, caucuses, benefited Bernie Sanders. Some of them benefited Hillary Clinton. So in a way, I think it's useful to see the full package being pushed because it really shows that it's not about any one candidate. It's about increasing voter participation in the process, which is supposed to be the goal.
I'm glad you and I agree. I hope that the Unity and Reform Commission, both sides, to coin a phrase, will take that to heart. There are things to be done that will be, if you put them in the 2016 context, will hurt your candidate. The diminishment of caucuses will hurt Sanders. The use of superdelegates, at least in theory, will hurt your Clinton. Let's do what's right for the voters. Let's maximize voter participation. I know, Ben, that's your focus, not only in the short term in terms of what the DNC should do, but overall. Now, I think there's a hugely interesting discussion that you brought to the table that I think is a little outside the scope of what the URC can do, which is what do we do with third party voters, et cetera. I mean, there is some aspect of it that it's attached here, but I think there's a whole other discussion about our entire systems, which may go beyond what the DNC can do. But they're interesting, and I think merit further discussion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It is beyond the scope of kind of what the Democratic Party can do, but it's something that I hope that Democratic Party leaders and people who are committed to increasing voter participation and the ability of people to participate in the democratic process in general will start to push more, because I think it would be very valuable and very much increase the representativeness of our government.
David, do you have some questions or thoughts for either one of us?
Well, I guess my question remains. I'm still interested in, I guess we'll have to wait and see what comes out of this commission report. I don't know what happened to our cage match here. Everybody seems to agree that we had a nice cage. We agree on the dimensions and that it's enclosed. We should have not maybe had a cage match. We want to have it more open and people can jump in the ring at any time. That becomes an issue. But I'm curious to see what gets put forward by the commission report and whether there's anybody making any sort of last stand in with regard to these issues, which I think we now seem between the two of you to have widespread or wide agreement on. It's not widespread; it's just you two. But at this point,
I'm a little agnostic on the open-closed thing, and there probably could have been a better representative for the closed argument. I just don't feel as strongly about it. I feel so strongly about caucuses that that they're so undemocratic that's my big issue for me. Yeah.
Ben, if you wanted to make a last pitch here on one particular, on anything.
Yeah, no, I would just say again on the open primaries, I think especially if you don't feel strongly about it, hopefully the argument that voter suppression is a spectrum, and if you do want to make it as inclusive as possible, you do same-day registration as the norm everywhere so that nobody is locked out of the process by not having the information beforehand or not being as tapped into the political process beforehand. I think that does make the Democratic primary process as inclusive as possible. And then again, you can think about reforms later on to the more general process that politicians push to help out more generally with voters having a say.
Yeah,
I do think that your discussion on same day registration and all of these things. First of all, I think that seems to be the consensus in the resolution. But I think the real problem comes with how do you make it happen? We can write proclamations that every state should have it, but we don't control the state governments. And if the DNC can't even tell New York what to do, frankly. The real issue is punishment. And I think that one of the most interesting things that you and I talked about that we probably should spend some more time on is how willing are people to give the DNC the power to punish states or state parties that don't follow their rules. Whatever rules we decide on, how do you enforce them? I think it's a big issue.
I am with you on that, and I think punishment in this case is very important.
Yeah, well, that's
right,
probably
David, we're
something
going to give you back.
Yeah, I'll have to take it out from here. Yeah, that's something that likely the Unity Commission won't be addressing, and will have to be taken up separately. But anyway, I guess we do have to close it out here. We'll end at this point. But thanks, Ben, for coming on with us, Armando, for arranging this. And well, maybe it's something we should do again, or have a second round of, or get some other voices to involve in all of this as well.
I think that's all true, and I would welcome Ben coming back if he's willing to after December 8th and 9th when we see what the actual proposals are from
That's
URC.
probably the next thing we have to wait for.
Let's all react to what they actually do.
Yeah.
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you guys both so much for having me.
Thank you for staying for the full hour as well, and for taking care of the rest of the show, both of you guys. I appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll talk again. And let me wrap up and hand the microphone over then to the next program joining us on the air. Thanks again to you two guys for joining us.
Ben, you're leaving with me. So
take him out, Armando. Thanks again, guys. We'll be considering what they have to say. We'll be considering what the report has to say when things come out. We'll see if we can get closer to a resolution on the question of open versus closed primaries. I'm not a big believer necessarily one way or the other, although I will say, frankly, in the age of outside interference in our general election, and in the age of the sort of no-holds-barred style of politics that Donald Trump and his ilk now bring to the situation, I'm a little bit worried about what kind of mischief can be made in same-day registration, but I have sort of an inchoate fear at this point. Anyway, I do want to hand the mic over to the debut of the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy Justice's new program. I'll tell you a little bit about it after
Daily
this.
Co's Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Some technical problems prevented the launch of the show yesterday, but the first debut episode of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy now open for today. There's all sorts of amazing things. Online racism, anti-Semitic memes, all of the amazing, horrible things that have been happening. Now, you know what? I blew this intro. We'll just hand things over to Justice.